On the 11th of July 1881, at 4 in the morning, a 16-year-old boy stood on the deck of HMS Bacchante somewhere between Melbourne and Sydney and watched a ship that should have not existed cross his bow. A brig, fully rigged, glowing red from stem to stern, as if lit from inside, masts and spars and sails standing out sharp against nothing but black ocean. 200 yards away, 13 men saw it. The officer of the watch saw it. The boys saw it. And by 11:15 that same morning, the sailor who had spotted it first fell from the foremast and hit the deck dead. That boy was Prince George of Wales. He would become King George V. The sighting was not scribbled in some private diary and locked away. It was entered into the official ship's log and published 4 years later in a book about the voyage. A future King of England, backed by a dozen corroborating witnesses, recording the appearance of a ghost ship in an official naval document. The lookout who saw it first did not survive the day. The Commodore, who also witnessed it, died of a sudden illness shortly after. The ship they saw had a name. Sailors had been calling it the Flying Dutchman for at least a century before George was born. The story behind that name is stranger than the ghost itself, because the Flying Dutchman everyone thinks they know was almost entirely invented by novelists and opera composers in the 1800s, crafted onto a much older, much rougher piece of maritime folklore that had been circulating on ships since the Dutch Golden Age. The ghost came first, the story came later, and the two have been tangled together so thoroughly that separating them takes some doing. Start with the legend as most people have absorbed it. A Dutch East India Company merchantman, heavy with silks and spices, is rounding the Cape of Good Hope sometime around 1641. The captain is a man called Hendrik van der Decken, a name that translates to something like Hendrik of the Deck, which is about as generic as Dutch names get. The storm is ferocious, crew and passengers beg him to take shelter, to turn back, to wait it out. Van der Decken refuses. He shakes his fist at the sky and swears he will round the Cape if it takes him until Doomsday. An angel hears this, or the devil hears it, depending on who is telling the story. Either way, the oath is accepted on its exact terms. The ship can never make port, the crew can never die. Van der Decken must sail, storm-tossed, from that moment until the Day of Judgment. Not a year of it, not a century of it, but every last moment until the end of time. To see the Flying Dutchman at sea is the worst omen a sailor can receive. Disaster follows, then shipwreck, then death. In some inverted versions of the tradition, only a member of the Dutchman's phantom crew can be released by sighting a normal, living ship, which flips the whole thing. The ghost is not hunting you, it is begging to be noticed, and the terror is that noticing it binds you to its fate. There is a detail in the legend that most retellings gloss over, but that is genuinely unsettling. In many versions, the phantom ship approaches other vessels and lowers a boat. The boat carries letters. The letters are addressed to people who have been dead for decades, sometimes centuries, wives, children, business partners, all of them in the ground before the letters were written. Accepting the letters brings doom. The Dutchman is not just sailing forever. He is trying to send mail home to a world that no longer contains anyone he knew. That image, a dead captain posting letters to dead recipients through a living postal service that cannot deliver them, is one of the creepiest ideas in all of maritime folklore, and it rarely gets the attention it deserves. That is the story. Now here is the problem with it. Almost none of it is old. The name Van der Decken does not appear anywhere in print until 1821. The curse, the oath, the storm, the doomsday vow, the angel hearing the blasphemy, all of it was assembled between roughly 1790 and 1843 by a sequence of writers who kept adding layers to what started as a single throwaway sentence in a travel memoir. The legend everyone treats as ancient maritime folklore is, in reality, a product of the Romantic era. poets and novelists built it. They built it well enough that people forgot it was built at all. And there are competing versions that most people never hear about. The blasphemy and curse telling is the one that survived into popular culture, but it was not the only version circulating. Walter Scott wrote a variant where the captain commits murder aboard his own ship, plague breaks out, and every port in the world refuses entry. No divine punishment, no angels, no doomsday oaths. Just a crime and its consequence, permanent exile on open water. The Devil's Bargain version strips the theology out entirely. The captain trades his soul for speed or survival, gets both, and the price is that he can never die and never stop. Then there is the Dice with Death version, the Falkenberg variant, which is pure folk horror. No backstory, no moral lesson, just a man rolling dice with the devil for eternity on a ship that drifts the North Sea without purpose. Each version emphasizes a different fear. Blasphemy, murder, greed, or the sheer meaninglessness of an existence without end. The Dutchman absorbed them all. The first time anyone wrote the words Flying Dutchman in a printed book was 1790. John MacDonald, a Scottish traveller, published a memoir of 30 years of wandering across Europe, Asia, and Africa. One sentence. The weather was so stormy, MacDonald wrote, that the sailors said they saw the Flying Dutchman. No captain's name, no backstory, no curse. Just a name the sailors already knew, used casually, the way you would mention any common superstition. That single line tells us the oral legend was already widespread among working sailors by the late 1700s, but MacDonald felt no need to explain it, which means his readers probably knew what it was too. 5 years later, a book about the voyage to Botany Bay mentioned the ghost ship in passing. Then in 1798, Samuel Taylor Coleridge published the Rime of the Ancient Mariner. Coleridge did not write a Flying Dutchman poem by name, but he lifted a specific motif from Dutch folk tradition, a captain playing dice with death for his soul on an eternal voyage. That motif came from a lesser-known variant of the legend attached to a captain named Falkenberg, who was condemned to sail the North Sea forever, gambling with the devil aboard his own ship. Coleridge took that image and made it English. The real literary construction began in 1813 when Sir Walter Scott published Rokeby, a narrative poem that recast the Dutchman as a pirate. In Scott's version, a murder is committed aboard the ship, plague breaks out, and every port refuses to let them dock. So they sail. This was the first time anyone had bothered to write a full Anglo version of the story, rather than just referencing it as common knowledge. Then came the piece that planted most of what people think they know. In May 1821, an anonymous writer published Van der Decken's message home in Blackwood's Edinburgh magazine. This is where the name Hendrik van der Decken appears for the first time. This is where the letters to the dead motif gets its full treatment. This is where the 7-year search for the cape becomes part of the story. Almost every retelling since 1821 descends from this one magazine article by a writer whose name we do not know. In 1826, Edward Fitzball turned it into a stage melodrama in London. Huge hit. The Dutchman was now mass entertainment. In 1833, Heinrich Heine published a short novel that added the single most famous element of the whole legend, redemption. In Heine's version, every 7 years the captain may come ashore, and if he can find a woman who will be faithful to him unto death, the curse breaks. Heine played it for irony. The idea of a ghost captain desperately trying to get married every 7 years struck him as absurd, and he wrote it that way. He did not expect anyone to take it seriously. Richard Wagner took it dead seriously. In 1843, Wagner premiered Der Fliegende Hollander, the opera that made the Flying Dutchman a household name across Europe. Wagner kept Heine's redemption plot but drained the irony out of it completely. In the opera, a woman named Senta becomes so consumed by the Dutchman's story that she leaps into the sea to prove her faithfulness, and the Dutchman is saved. Wagner claimed he was inspired by a real storm he experienced crossing from Riga to London in July and August of 1839. The Baltic gale was violent enough that the ship had to shelter in a Norwegian fjord, and Wagner later said he felt the legend in his bones and heard sailors calling out the Dutchman's name during the worst of it. Whether that is true or a good story Wagner told about himself is hard to say. What is not debatable is the opera's effect. It made a sailor's superstition into serious art. It has been performed continuously for over 180 years. More people know the Flying Dutchman from Wagner than from any other source, including the original folklore. Then there was Frederick Marryat, who published The Phantom Ship as a novel between 1837 and 1839. Marryat's hero is Philip van der Decken, the cursed captain's son, trying to save his father's soul by delivering a holy relic. The novel is gothic, romantic, and contains a werewolf side story in chapter 39 called The White Wolf of the Harz Mountains that became famous on its own. Marryat's novel was the first full-length book about the legend and influenced Melville, Conrad, and Stevenson. So by 1843, in the space of about 50 years, the Flying Dutchman had gone from a name sailors muttered during storms to a fully realized myth with a named captain, a specific curse, a redemption arc, a love interest, and an opera. The speed of that construction is unusual. Most legends accrete slowly over centuries. The Flying Dutchman was manufactured in a single literary generation, but manufactured from what? The raw material was real and it was ugly. The legend is rooted in the Dutch Golden Age, roughly 1600 to 1700, the era when the Dutch East India Company dominated the sea route from Amsterdam to Batavia, which is modern-day Jakarta. That route went around the Cape of Good Hope, and the Cape of Good Hope was, and remains, one of the most dangerous stretches of open water on the planet. The name itself is a lie. When Bartolomeu Dias first rounded it in 1488, he called it Cabo das Tormentas, Cape of Storms. That was an honest name. Dias had barely survived the rounding, and he named the place for what it had done to him. King John II of Portugal renamed it Cabo da Boa Esperança, Cape of Good Hope, as a piece of propaganda to make sailors willing to go there. The hope was commercial, not meteorological. The Cape was the gateway to the spice trade, and the spice trade was worth more than the lives of the men who sailed through the gateway. The renaming worked, sailors went. Many of them did not come back. The Flying Dutchman legend is partly a folk rebellion against that rebranding. Sailors knew what the Cape was. They had their own name for it, passed from crew to crew in dockside taverns, and it was not hopeful. The physics of the place explains why. The cold Benguela current runs up the west coast of Africa. The warm Agulhas current runs down the east coast. They collide at the Cape. That collision produces rogue waves, single walls of water, confirmed by radar and satellite to reach over 30 meters. 30 meters is roughly the height of a 10-story building, arriving as a single moving wall with no warning and no predecessor. These are not theoretical. They sink modern ships. The Agulhas current generates rogue waves at a rate that oceanographers consider anomalous even by the standards of dangerous water. On top of the waves, the Cape produces sudden gales. The Cape Doctor, a southeasterly wind, can hit 120 kilometers per hour with almost no warning. It earned that nickname because it was said to blow the pestilence out of Cape Town, which is a generous interpretation of a wind that can shred sails and snap masts. Dense fog forms where the temperature gradients are sharpest, and they are sharpest exactly where the two currents meet. Over 3,000 wrecks are documented along that coastline, more than almost any other stretch of shore on Earth. 3,000 ships across 5 centuries piled up along the same ribbon of coast. Between 1595 and 1795, the VOC lost roughly 105 ships to weather, wrecks, or outright disappearance on the Cape route. 105 ships in 2 centuries. A cartographic analysis of these losses shows them clustering around the same stretch of coast, the same currents, the same convergence zone where cold water meets warm. Every one of those vanished vessels generated a rumor. Every rumor fed the folklore. The Dutch Republic was also the rival or outright enemy of the British, Portuguese and Spanish, all of whom contributed their own versions of the story. A cursed Dutch ship was a culturally convenient villain for British sailors who had every reason to enjoy the idea of God punishing the competition. Popular retellings cite a VOC ship lost off the Cape in 1641 as the original Flying Dutchman, but no VOC log confirms this specific vessel. The date was probably folded in retroactively to give the legend a historical anchor it did not actually need. 2 real men may have inspired the myth, and one of them is genuinely interesting. Bernard Fokke was a Frisian-born VOC captain who appears in company records as a master of the galliot, the snooper, which translates roughly as the snooper. Fokke was famous for something that made no sense to anyone at the time: the speed of his voyages. A round trip between the Dutch Republic and Java took other captains 8 or 9 months. Fokke did it in barely 3. To put that in perspective, the VOC route from Amsterdam to Batavia ran roughly 15,000 nautical miles one way. Other captains sailed it and back in the better part of a year. Fokke did it in a quarter of that time. Nobody could explain how. The winds did not blow differently for Bernard Fokke. The currents did not part for him. Sailors whispered that he had made a pact with the devil in exchange for fair winds. It was said he had reinforced his masts with iron so no storm could snap them. Iron reinforced masts in the 17th century when wood was the only structural material anyone trusted on a ship. Whether that detail is true or exaggerated, it circulated widely enough to stick, and it is the kind of specific technical rumor that tends to have at least a seed of truth in it. People do not invent iron masts as a detail. They repeat something they heard from a shipwright or a dockhand. After one voyage, Fokke simply never returned. His ship vanished, no wreckage washed ashore, no survivors turned up in any port, no explanation was ever offered, and the legend coalesced around his disappearance with a neatness that feels almost scripted. The captain who was too fast, whose speed could only be explained by a deal with the devil, swallowed by the same sea he had beaten too many times. Fokke is the strongest historical candidate for the real Flying Dutchman, and yet most people who know the legend have never heard his name. Van der Decken, the fictional captain from an anonymous 1821 magazine article, pushed him out of his own story. The other candidate is a figure called Valkenburg from a North Sea variant of the story. Valkenburg is condemned to sail forever, playing dice with the devil for his soul. This is the folk horror version, the one Coleridge borrowed from, and it has a different flavor than the Van der Decken story. No blasphemy, no fist shaken at heaven. Just a man trapped in an endless game he can never win on a ship that will never dock. The Dutch language tradition also sometimes names the cursed Captain van Straten instead of Van der Decken. That may be the oldest form of the name, older than the one the 1821 Blackwoods article popularized. The VOC itself is worth lingering on for a moment, because the Dutchman legend is inseparable from the company that created the conditions for it. The VOC was the first multinational corporation, and in the modern sense, the first company to issue stock and arguably the most powerful commercial entity the world had seen up to that point. At its peak, it had more ships than most navies. It employed tens of thousands of sailors. Its route to the East Indies was a production line: silks, spices, porcelain, tea flowing west, silver and textiles flowing east. The Cape was the bottleneck where that production line kept breaking. Every lost ship was lost cargo, lost revenue, lost sailors whose families would never know what happened. The VOC did not send search parties for missing vessels. The balance sheet absorbed the loss. The next ship sailed on schedule. In that context, the Dutchman legend reads differently. It is not just a ghost story about divine punishment. It is the nightmare image of what the VOC actually did to people. Sent them around the Cape over and over, and some of them never came back, and the company kept going as if they had never existed. The Dutchman is a ship that can't stop moving, cannot make port, cannot rest, driven endlessly by the obligation to deliver cargo that will never arrive. The VOC would have understood that nightmare better than anyone, because the VOC was the entity most directly responsible for creating the conditions that produced it. The company and the ghost are inseparable. One made the other possible. Back to the sightings, because the Flying Dutchman has a paper trail that most ghost stories would envy. The earliest documented sighting after the legend entered print came in 1823. HMS Levin, under Captain W.F.W. Owen, was off Danger Point heading for Simon's Bay in the Cape Colony. Owen logged a strange sailing ship approaching and initially mistook it for his consort HMS Barracuda. He changed course toward it. When the stranger lowered a boat, Owen remembered the legend about accepting letters from the dead and hauled off. That detail matters. A Royal Navy captain in 1823, in command of a warship on official business, changed course away from an unidentified vessel because of a piece of folklore about ghost letters. The superstition had operational weight. It affected decisions. 2 weeks later at Simon's Bay, comparison of logs showed HMS Barracuda had been 300 miles away. At the time, the ship Owen saw was never identified. Owen filed it in his log and moved on, because there was nothing else to do with it. In 1835, the crew of an unnamed British vessel saw a Dutch merchant ship bearing down on them in a storm. Collision seemed certain. Then the ship vanished. Then the Bacchante sighting in 1881, which is where this story started. Prince George, 13 witnesses, the red glow, the dead sailor. Published in the cruise of Her Majesty's ship Bacchante, 1879 to 1882, printed in 1886, available to anyone who wants to read it. A royal heir, his elder brother Prince Albert Victor, the officer of the watch, and 10 other men, all saw the same thing at 4 in the morning, and none of them could explain it. That one needs no further elaboration. It speaks for itself. In 1911, an American whaler nearly collided with the Phantom of the Cape Peninsula. The ship disappeared as it closed. Then the civilian sightings, which are stranger in some ways than the naval ones because civilians have no professional reason to log ghost ships and no institutional culture of maritime superstition to prime them. In 1939, on Glencairn Beach in False Bay, South Africa, a woman named Helene Tidell and roughly 60 other sunbathers watched a fully rigged sailing ship under full sail approach the shore on a collision course. There was no wind that day, not a breeze. The sea was flat. The ship was moving under full canvas in a dead calm, headed straight for the beach, and the people watching it had no context for what they were seeing. This was not a foggy night in the middle of the Atlantic with superstitious sailors clutching their crucifixes. This was a sunny afternoon on a public beach full of ordinary people watching something they could not explain. And then it was gone. South African newspapers covered it at the time. In 1941, another crowd on the same beach reported a nearly identical vessel, under full sail that disappeared before reaching shore. The same beach, 2 years apart, same type of ship, same windless conditions. In 1942, HMS Jubilee was en route to the Royal Navy base at Simonstown when, at 9 in the evening, 2 officers spotted a schooner under full sail in a dead calm. The rig was of a type neither could identify, which is a telling detail. These were trained naval officers who knew ship profiles the way a mechanic knows engine types, and they could not place the rigging. Signals went unanswered. Jubilee had to change course to avoid collision. The ship vanished. One of those 2 officers was Nicholas Montserrat, who would later write The Cruel Sea, one of the defining novels of the Second World War. Montserrat saw the Flying Dutchman. It went into the ship's log. The man who would become one of the great chroniclers of life at sea had his own encounter with the most famous ghost in maritime history, and he never satisfactorily explained it. During the war, German U-boat crews under Admiral Karl Donitz reportedly logged sightings of the phantom east of the Suez Canal. Those reports were never officially released but surfaced in post-war interviews. What submarine crews were doing reporting ghost sailing ships while engaged in the most lethal naval campaign of the 20th century is a question nobody has answered convincingly. A pattern runs through nearly every sighting. They cluster geographically. Almost all of them occur near the Cape of Good Hope or in the southern oceans. Very few are in the open Atlantic or Pacific, and there is a reason for that, and the reason has a name. Fata Morgana. The term comes from Italian, named after Morgan Le Fay, the witch of Arthurian legend whose magic was said to conjure floating castles in the air above the Strait of Messina. Sicilian fishermen saw cities hanging in the sky above the water and blamed her. A Fata Morgana is a specific type of superior mirage, and it works like this. When a layer of warm air sits over a layer of cold, dense air, you get a strong thermal inversion. Light from a real object far beyond the visible horizon bends as it passes through that temperature gradient. The bending is not gentle, it can be severe enough to curve light around the Earth's surface, bringing images of objects that are physically below the horizon into view. The image of the object is lifted above its actual position. Sometimes it is duplicated, appearing both right side up and upside down, stacked on top of each other. The object appears to float in the sky or on water where no water exists, or directly on the sea surface hundreds of yards away when it is actually 40 miles distant. The conditions shift second by second. The image shimmers, stretches vertically until a fishing boat looks like a cathedral, compresses until a freighter looks like a raft, vanishes abruptly mid-sentence as the temperature gradient collapses, races along the horizon against the wind. A real sailing ship far beyond the curve of the earth can appear as a fully rigged vessel 200 yards off the port bow, glowing with refracted sunlight or moonlight, and then cease to exist between one heartbeat and the next. That description matches Prince George's 1881 account with uncomfortable precision, and the Cape of Good Hope is where these mirages happen more frequently than almost anywhere else on Earth. The cold Benguela current meeting the warm Agulhas current creates exactly the air temperature gradients a Fata Morgana requires. The physics of that specific patch of ocean manufactures ghost ships. It has been doing so for as long as the currents have been colliding, which is to say, for longer than humans have been sailing. The science settles the optics. A Fata Morgana explains the glowing ship, the impossible approach speed, the abrupt disappearance, the fact that the phantom was always seen where cold and warm water meet. It explains why these sightings clustered at the Cape and not, say, in the English Channel. What it does not explain is the cultural weight. Why a 17th century Dutch merchantman? Why always Dutch? The answer is obvious once you say it, because that is what sailors expected to see. The human eye observes a mirage. The human brain, soaked in 2 centuries of folklore, fills in the rigging, the whole shape, the name. Fata Morgana gives you a floating ship. Culture gives you the Flying Dutchman. The phenomenon is physics, but the interpretation is fear. There is also the question of why this particular ghost story outlived every other maritime superstition. Sailors had dozens of them. Ghost ships, sea serpents, mermaids, phantom lights, cursed voyages, most faded. The Dutchman did not. Part of the answer is Wagner, who turned a superstition into an opera that kept the name alive in concert halls for 2 centuries. Part of it is timing. The legend solidified in print during the Romantic era, when poets and novelists were hungry for exactly this kind of material, and they gave it a literary polish that other ghost stories never received. But a deeper part of it is what the Dutchman represents: hubris punished. A man who defies nature and got condemned to fight the same storm forever. The secular 19th century added the redemption through love angle, because it feared endless life more than death, and that gave the story an emotional core that mere horror cannot match. Fear fades, loneliness does not. The myth has traveled far from the sea. Wagner's opera remains one of the most performed in the world. Marriott's novel shaped the Gothic sea fiction tradition. Edgar Allan Poe borrowed the imagery for MS, found in a bottle in 1833, which is a Flying Dutchman story in everything but name. In 1951, Pandora and the Flying Dutchman put Ava Gardner and James Mason into a Wagnerian romance on film. Pirates of the Caribbean merged the Dutchman with the separate British myth of Davy Jones's Locker, the sea bottom where drowned sailors rest, combining 2 different legends into one creature. SpongeBob SquarePants turned the Dutchman into a green ghostly pirate voiced by Brian Doyle Murray, which is as far from Wagner as a legend can travel. In the real world, KLM, the Dutch flag carrier airline, still officially goes by the nickname the Flying Dutchman. There is an Olympic 2-man dinghy class named after it. Hannes Wagner, the American Baseball Hall of Famer of German descent, was called the Flying Dutchman. So were Dutch footballers Johan Cruyff and Dennis Bergkamp. The version that sticks with me though is the 20th century reinterpretation that moved the curse from the ship to a passenger. In 1959, the Twilight Zone aired an episode called Judgment Night. A Nazi U-boat captain finds himself aboard the passenger ship he torpedoed, living through the sinking over and over, forever. The Flying Dutchman is no longer a vessel. It is a man condemned to witness his own crime on repeat until the end of time. That is the modern version of the myth, stripped of sails and spices and the cape, reduced to its core, an act so terrible that the universe refuses to let it end. The cape still kills ships. Rogue waves still form where the currents meet. Fata Morgana still shimmer over the water south of Falls Bay, and once in a while, in the right conditions, at the right hour, a ship appears where no ship should be, glowing faintly, moving against the wind, and then it is gone. The Dutchman is not a ghost, it is a mirage wearing a story that took 200 years to build, assembled by Scottish travelers, English poets, German composers, and anonymous magazine writers who never agreed on the captain's name or the nature of his crime. The only thing they agreed on was this: somewhere off the Cape, a ship sails that cannot stop sailing. And if you see it, something terrible is about to happen to you. Science will tell you why you saw it, it will not tell you why you were afraid, and it will not explain why, after 400 years, the ship is still sailing,